A judge in Georgia recently tried a divorce case, put the children in the mother's custody, and explained what he had done by saying this: "I ain't never seen a calf following a bull." The reason the judge never saw a calf following a bull is that cattle don't live in two-parent families. If we want to live like cattle, mother custody is the right policy. Most of us would rather live like human beings in two-parent families. The judge thinks correctly that the female-headed reproductive unit of the cattle and of pigs, horses, dogs, and cats is more natural because it is closer to mammalian biology. With these other species, the mother is almost everything, the father almost nothing. The father performs his stud function and disappears. The mother bears the offspring, nourishes them, protects them, educates them. This is the reproductive structure of the ghetto, the barnyard, and the rainforest. It is the structure to which the larger society is reverting, thanks to the anti-male bias of the legal system, assisted, of course, by the welfare system. Margaret Mead said about what the judge was trying to articulate: the female role is a biological fact. The male role is a social creation. But what is the inference? If the male role is a social creation, then not creating it is pretty much the same thing as destroying it, as the Georgia judge did in the case he tried. Most people are unaware that in the 19th century, father custody was automatic and mandatory in divorce cases. One consequence was that divorces, most of which are initiated by wives, were rare events, only about 7,000 annually when the original feminists met at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 and complained that divorce cost women their children. Today's judges expel millions of fathers from their homes because they feel correctly that the male role is biologically the weak link in the family, just as Margaret Mead says. But what follows is that if society wants two-parent families, it must support the father's role because it is the weak biological link in the family. The naturalness of the female-headed family is unquestionable, but the question needs to be asked whether the success of the human species is not connected, in some way judges do not understand, with the presence in the reproductive unit of the father. According to feminist anthropologist Sarah Hardy, in all but a few species, females are permanent residents in social groups, males mere transients. Where fathers lack a secure role within the family, we have ghettos, Indian reservations, the islands of the Caribbean. Where the father's role is secure, we have stable families such as those of Orientals and Jews and Mormons, with their law-abiding and high-achieving children. Westinghouse Corporation recently staged a science scholarship contest and awarded scholarships to the 11 best students they could find. Every one of the 11 was an Asian American student, which is to say a student who almost certainly grew up in a patriarchal family. The female-headed family is found in pre-civilized societies, and it reemerges in civilized societies in times of catastrophe and social upheaval. When men are killed on battlefields or thrown into prisons, female-headed families carry on. When ghetto males sit on curbsides and get stoned, ghetto females and children stay home and watch TV. A 19th century German ship's doctor described the female-headed family situation in the German African colony of Cameroon this way: with a large number of tribes, inheritance is based on maternity. Paternity is immaterial. Brothers and sisters are only the children of one mother. A man does not bequeath his property to his children, but to the children of his sister, that is to say, to his nephews and nieces, as his nearest demonstrable blood relatives. A chief of the Way people explained to me in horrible English, "My sister and I are certainly blood relatives. Consequently, her son is my heir. When I die, he will be the king of my town." "And your father?" I inquired. "I don't know what that means, my father," he answered. Upon my putting to him the question whether he had no children, rolling on the ground with laughter, he answered that, with them, men have no children, only women. Originally, writes William Robertson Smith, there was no kinship except in the female line, and the introduction of male kinship was a kind of social revolution which modified society to its very roots. Kinship through female, says John McLennan, must be a more archaic system of relationship than kinship through males, the product of an earlier and ruder stage in human development than the latter, somewhat more than a step farther back in the direction of savagery. Wherever non-advancing communities are to be found, isolated in islands or maintaining their savage liberties in mountain fastnesses, there to this day exists the system of kinship through females only. The female-headed unit is the pattern of the Hopi Indians, of whom Fred Egan says this: the central core or axis of the household is composed of a line of women, a segment of a lineage. All the members of the segment, male or female, are born in the household and consider it their home, but only the women normally reside there after marriage. The men of the lineage leave at marriage to reside in the households of their wives, returning to their natal home on various ritual and ceremonial occasions, or in case of separation or divorce, which is frequent. Into the household, in turn, come other men through marriage. The household revolves about a central and continuing core of women. The men are peripheral with divided residences and loyalties. A.I. Richards calls this pattern the institution of the visiting husband or the visiting brother, and remarks that the pattern is characterized by unstable marriages. It is the pattern of the ghettos, where illegitimacy now exceeds 50%, and where men and boys grow increasingly role-less and violent, and where women live in poverty and complain of their insufficient subsidization. Thanks to judges like the one quoted at the beginning of this tape, it is the pattern of increasing numbers of households in the larger society. According to the Washington-based National Center for Policy Alternatives, 40% of girls in school today will be heads of households. The pathology of the female-headed family ought to be obvious, but evidently it isn't. Everyone knows that the high-crime areas of his city are those areas with the largest numbers of families headed by women. Yet lawmakers and judges can't draw the obvious conclusion that social policy ought to discourage the creation of female-headed families. Most criminals grew up in female-headed families. Most gang members grew up in female-headed families. The same is true of most addicts, most rapists, most educational failures, most teenage suicides. Every presidential assassin before Hinckley grew up in a female-headed family, or one in which he had an impossibly bad relationship with his father. Most illegitimate births occur to females who themselves grew up in female-headed families. A judge will try a divorce case in the morning and place the children in the custody of the mother. He will try a criminal case in the afternoon and send a man to prison for robbing a liquor store. The chances are 3 out of 4 that the criminal he sends to prison grew up in a female-headed household just like the one he himself created that morning when he tried the divorce case. The judge can't see the connection between these cases for 3 reasons. Reason number 1 is the generation-long time lag between the creation of the female-headed family and the crime it's more likely to produce. The children don't leave the divorce courtroom and go out and rob liquor stores. But they do grow older. They do eventually reach the high crime age of the teens and 20s, and only then do the consequences of family breakdown come to the surface. Let's illustrate. In 1980, crime increased by 17%. Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates was flabbergasted. Nothing in the economy, he said, could account for such a growth in crime in a single year. What did account for it was the huge increase in divorce and illegitimacy back in the mid-1960s. In the 60s, the damage inflicted on the children made fatherless by the divorce courts and by the breakdown of sexual law and order passed unnoticed. It was only when the kids reached the high crime ages in the early 1980s that the public and Chief Gates realized that something had gone wrong. What that something was, people still haven't figured out, because the idea of a cause preceding its effect by 5, 10, 15, or 20 years is too difficult to grasp. The preferred solution is to get tough on criminals, to hand out stiffer sentences, to build more prisons. Reason number 2 why the judge can't see the connection between family breakdown and crime is that even though most criminals were fatherless children, most fatherless children aren't criminals. Most single mothers do a tolerable job of bringing up their kids, considering the problems they face. So do most orphan asylums. So do most foster homes. Most kids who run away from home and sleep under freeway overpasses turn out okay. Human resiliency keeps most fatherless children out of jail. But this doesn't alter the fact that most criminals, like most addicts, most educational failures, most rapists, most teenage suicides, and so forth, were fatherless. A comparison with drunk driving is appropriate. Most drunk drivers don't get into accidents. Most drunk drivers get home safely, sleep it off, and get to work the next day. Does this mean that drunk driving is okay? Of course not, since drunks are greatly overrepresented among the people who do have accidents, just as fatherless children are overrepresented in the prison population. Reason number 3 why judges can't see the connection between the family breakdown and criminality and other social pathology is sentimental reverence for the sanctity of motherhood. The fact that most child abuse and the worst child abuse is committed by mothers, especially single mothers, is conveniently forgotten between one Mother's Day and the next. According to an Oklahoma judge, courts know that mother love is a dominant trait in the hearts of the mother, even in the weakest of women. It is of divine origin, and in nearly all cases far exceeds and surpasses the parental affection of the father. Every just man recognizes the fact that minor children need the constant bestowal of the mother's care and love. According to an Idaho judge, the preference for the mother needs no argument to support it because it arises out of the very nature and instincts of motherhood. Nature has ordained it. Similarly, a Florida court declared, nature has prepared a mother to bear and rear her young, and to perform many services for them, and to give them many attentions for which the father is not equipped. In 1974, the Utah Supreme Court brushed aside a father's equal protection challenge to a maternal preference custody statute, stating that the contention might have some merit to it in a proper case if the father was equally gifted in lactation as the mother. A New Jersey judge spoke of an inexorable natural force dictating maternal custody awards. A Maryland judge found the so-called preference for the mother as the custodian, particularly of younger children, is simply a recognition by the law, as well as by the commonality of man, of the universal verity that the maternal tie is so primordial that it should not be lightly severed or attenuated. We pay these dummies fancy salaries to perform this kind of reasoning, which lumps together as young any offspring, from a babe in arms, damp from the womb, and groping to suckle from its mother's teat, to a teenage boy capable of committing crimes of violence, and far more likely to commit them if he has no father, or a teenage girl capable of breeding illegitimate children, and far more likely to breed them if she has no father. The judges focus their attention on the babe in arms and overlook the fact that babes grow into teenagers who don't need mom's lactating and diaper changing, but do need dad's socializing if they are to become responsible adults. Juvenile detention centers are bursting with these primordial citizens, thanks to judges' incomprehension of the fact that civilized society needs patriarchal socialization as well as female biology. There is no need for judges to worry about severing or attenuating mom's biology. Mom isn't going anywhere, not if dad has assured custody of his children and assured possession of his paycheck. She isn't going to give up her kids, her role, her status symbols, and her meal tickets. Judges suppose they must support the strongest link in the two-parent family, the mother's role, because it is the strongest. They should support the weakest link, the father's role, because it is the weakest. It is by doing this that they support the two-parent family, a patriarchal system, and civilization. It is for the purpose of stabilizing the two-parent family that patriarchal society and the legal system exist. Mom got along without patriarchal society and the legal system for 200 million years, since the dinosaurs were young. But dad has got to have them and have them on his side, or there will be no two-parent family. The two-parent family isn't natural. It isn't biological. It isn't primordial. It is a cultural creation, artificial, fragile, like civilization itself, both only a few thousand years old. The female-headed family is natural and biological and primordial, and that is why it is found in the barnyard and in the ghetto and on Indian reservations and in surviving Stone Age societies, where patriarchal socialization has never established itself. The two-parent family is what makes civilization possible, and vice versa, just as the breakdown of the two-parent family is what makes the ghetto possible and inevitable. Judges don't understand this, and that is why two-parent families are falling apart, and why crime and drugs and gangs and illegitimacy are out of control, why there is a garbage generation. According to feminist Dr. Barbara Bergman, we seem to be in the process of changing back to the single-parent method. That's right. This is happening in the ghettos because the welfare system makes male providers superfluous. It's happening in the larger society because judges have no understanding of how patriarchy works, of the fact that it must have the support of the legal system, which they are taking away from it. Reversion to the matriarchy of the Stone Age is the real program of the feminist sexual revolution, now mindlessly aided and abetted by the legal system. This means the abandoning of the social organization based on male kinship and the return to the tribal matriarchal system based on female kinship. Until about 5,000 years ago, motherhood meant single motherhood, with male, sometimes mom's husband, more often mom's brother, coming around to help out. Real fatherhood, in the sense of males being heads of families, is only about 5,000 years old. But these 5,000 years are the most important in the history of the planet. They created civilization and each and every one of the accomplishments of civilization. You can read about how this happened in Gerda Lerner's book, The Creation of Patriarchy. The patriarchal system is breaking down under the pressures of the feminist sexual revolution and the anti-male bias of the divorce courts. And it is not difficult to see the correlation between the breakdown of the patriarchal system and the two-parent patriarchal family and the breakdown of society itself. Feminist anthropologist Helen Fisher says this: men and women are moving toward the kind of roles they had on the grasslands of Africa millions and millions of years ago. Human society is now discovering its ancient roots. The recent trend toward divorce and remarriage is another example of a throwback to earlier times. The so-called new extended family, she means the broken family headed by the mother, may actually have evolved millennia ago. At long last, society is moving in a direction that should be highly compatible with our ancient human spirit. The traditional role of women is a recent invention. What Dr. Fisher is saying is that we are returning to the Stone Age, and she thinks this is good. The 5,000-year-old patriarchal revolution is being reversed by the feminist sexual revolution. Mother custody places mothers and children where many, perhaps most of them, live close to poverty, if not in poverty, where they have to be subsidized by taxpayers or ex-husbands. The judges place them at risk and then appeal to what I call the mutilated beggar argument. In Cairo, Egypt, there exists a cottage industry which kidnaps and mutilates children to be used as beggars. The more pitiable the mutilations are, the more the beggars will earn. The beggars are placed on a street corner with a begging bowl, and they ask for alms for the love of Allah. The almsgiver who drops a coin in the begging bowl is doing a good thing, paying for the beggar's next meal, but also a bad thing, ensuring that more children will be kidnapped and mutilated to be used as beggars. This mutilated beggar technique is employed extensively in the contemporary war over the family. Ex-wives drag their kids into poverty, then point to their sufferings as requiring ex-husbands or the welfare system to bail them out. The father or taxpayer who does bail them out is doing a good thing, providing rent and food money, but also a bad thing, financing the destruction of the family, encouraging the mass divorce, which is wrecking millions of other families, in effect undermining the patriarchal system and returning to matriarchy. The father who sends his ex-wife a support check is subsidizing the destruction of his own family and paying to have his children brought up in a female-headed household where they are far more likely to be mistreated, neglected, impoverished, delinquent, and sexually confused. Here's an example of how the mutilated beggar argument works. Lesbian feminist Charlotte Bunch complains about divorced women not getting as much of their ex-husband's paychecks as they did during marriage. She says, "No fault divorce laws sounded like equality, but since male and female incomes are not equal, and many women have worked for husbands for years, these laws cut off some women's badly needed and justified right to alimony. The wives have been working for the husbands, as she says, but the husbands have also been working for the wives. The wife's withdrawal of her services ends the husband's reciprocal obligations. And if the husband's income is greater, that proves the desirability of having a husband, not the justice of reducing an ex-husband to bondage. If being in need, the mutilated beggar argument, were enough to ensure the subsidization of ex-wives by ex-husbands, marriage would become superfluous except as a preliminary to divorce." In 1963, Betty Friedan told American wives they were parasites and weaklings and should be ashamed of themselves for taking a virtually free ride on the backs of their husbands. What then of an ex-wife who gets her free ride on the back of an ex-husband for whom she provides no reciprocal services whatever? She is doubly parasitic. Female economic need is one of the chief props of marriage. To say that divorce hurts women economically is simply to say that marriage benefits women economically. Meeting women's economic need by divorce arrangements means subsidizing ex-wives simply because they are female. A reductio ad absurdum of Betty Friedan's insistence that wives should stop being parasites, stand on their own feet, and compete without sexual privilege or excuse, Betty Friedan's words. The female-headed families which seek to exploit the mutilated beggar argument are the source of most of our social pathology. Feminists say that this pathology results from the poverty of these families, the cure for which is more of somebody else's money. But better subsidization of female-headed families will mean more female-headed families, more crime, more illegitimacy, and so on. The alternative to the female-headed family is not a better-funded female-headed family, but the patriarchal family, which produces not only more money, but less crime, more stability, and higher-achieving children. The props needed to make the patriarchal family once again normative could be easily restored by the father's control over his paycheck and society's guarantee of father custody in the event of divorce. Father custody would mean that few husbands would divorce their wives, knowing that without them they would be overburdened, just as single mothers are today, with the double role of breadwinning and childcare. It would mean few wives would divorce their husbands, knowing that divorce would cost them their children and their standard of living. It would place economic and psychological motivations on the side of stable marriage instead of pitting them against marriage. The poverty of female-headed families is notorious. According to Betty Friedan, statistics indicate that a child now in poverty in a family headed by a man has a 50-50 chance of getting out of poverty by his or her majority, but that a child in a family in poverty headed by a woman has no chance. Divorced women, according to Ms. Magazine, have the lowest household incomes of any group of women. Worldwide, according to Kathleen Newland, between 1/4 and 1/3 of all families are supported by women, and worldwide, these families are leading candidates for poverty and hardship. But the poverty is not the only problem, or the worst. 80% of children in psychiatric clinics came from female-headed homes. Single women family heads have the highest rate of disease compared to all other women, far higher than the never married. They report less satisfaction with their lives than Americans in any other marital status, including widows and women who have never been married. A child living in a female-headed home is 10 times more likely to be beaten or murdered. There exists a common belief that children who are abused grow up to become abusive parents themselves. This is sometimes the case, but often not the case. According to researchers Rosemary Hunter and Nancy Kilstom, the children who were abused but grew up to become non-abusive parents came mostly from intact families. They say if they had been abused, it was by one parent, while the other parent served as a supportive life raft in a sea of trouble and pain. In other words, the kids who survived abuse and became decent parents came from father-present families. The two-parent family saved them. So when a judge takes children from a two-parent family and places them in a female-headed family, he is removing them from the patriarchal system which protects them, and he is placing them in the matriarchal system where a disproportionate amount of child abuse occurs. In 1989, a social service officer in Milwaukee County by the name of Terrence Cooley wrote an inter-office communication titled AFDC Child Abuse Information, which found its way into print. Cooley pointed out that of the 1,050 cases of child abuse and neglect in that county, an astonishing 83% occurred in households receiving aid to families with dependent children. In other words, mostly female-headed households. According to USA Today, while working married women have the best health of any group of women, single mothers, working or unemployed, have the poorest. According to Irma Moilanen and Paula Rantacalio, fatherless children are much more likely to develop psychiatric problems. Boys 3 times as likely, girls 4 times. According to Sarah McClanahan and Larry Bumpus, Women who were raised in female-headed families are 53% likelier to have teenage marriages, 111% likelier to have teenage births, 164% likelier to have premarital births, 92% likelier to experience marital disruptions. Writing of the problems of female heads of families, Barbara Gelpy, Nancy Hartsaw, Claire Novak, and Myra Strober say, associated with such extreme hardship is the high incidence both of health problems and of troubles with older children among these families. The same point is made by Deborah K. Zinn and Rosemary Sari. Women also encountered a variety of serious problems with their older children. In one study, more than one-third were called to school in 1982 for special conferences, and 21% reported that their children had been suspended at least once. Girls in female-headed homes have more problems in sex role and personality development and in handling aggression. Father-deprived sons frequently exhibit aggressive behavior, lack of social responsibility, a variety of intellectual defects, high delinquency potential, tendencies toward homosexuality, difficulties in interpersonal relations, and low need for achievement. More than one-third of the children from female-headed homes drop out of school. Divorce researchers Judith Wallerstein and Joan Kelly were struck with the pervasive sadness they encountered among the 6 to 8-year-olds in female-headed families, a sadness not seldom transformed into rage at the mothers. E. Mavis Hetherington found that mothers in father-absent homes have more psychiatric symptoms than mothers in intact homes. According to Patricia Paskowitz, one-third of children of divorce living with their fathers seem pleased with their situation, compared with only 1/10 of those living with their mothers. The economic argument for father custody is by no means the most important, but it is the clearest. Most men do earn more money than most women, and this is a reason for father custody. Instead of this, of course, feminists use the earning difference, combined with the mutilated beggar argument, as a pitch for higher alimony and child support awards. Dr. Lenore Weitzman's spurious arguments to this effect are so often appealed to that they deserve to be examined. Her book, The Divorce Revolution, argues that it's unjust for ex-husbands to walk away from the marriage with their earning ability intact, while the ex-wife has little earning ability to walk away with. This male earning ability, the principal inducement the man had to offer the woman for marriage, is referred to as an asset of the marriage. And therefore, by feminist logic, belongs equally to the unmarried, divorced woman and the unmarried man. While the children, the chief asset of the marriage from the man's point of view, are presumed to be the property of the woman by biological right. The statistic Dr. Weitzman offers in support of her contention, the divorced man's standard of living is said to rise by 42%, the divorced woman's standard of living to fall by 73%, have become an established part of the folklore of feminism. The original feminist position, given in Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, had been that women ought to be independent, stand on their own feet, and face life's challenges on their own without sexual privilege or excuse. Ms. Friedan withdrew this view when the cold winds of economics began blowing, and her feminist followers began blaming her for the loss of their husbands' paychecks. Betty Friedan said this: "We did not realize the trap we were falling into." This is 1976. "We fell into a trap when we said no alimony, because housewives who divorced were in terrible straits. We fell into another trap by accepting no-fault divorce without provision for mandatory settlements. Being independent was great as long as it meant not having reciprocal responsibilities. Losing the free ride was less great. It was accordingly necessary to devise a new justification for the ex-wife's retaining of the ex-husband's money, this being that most of the assets of the marriage consist of the husband's earning ability. The argument is thus stated by feminist Terry Arundel. Most of these divorced women viewed their husband's earnings and earning ability as rightfully being a community property issue. Ms. Arundel regards it as proper that ex-husbands should subsidize ex-wives, but wholly unfair that ex-wives, if they remarry and become dependent on a different man, would lose all financial help from their former husbands, while their ex-husbands could remarry at will and still lose nothing that they had taken out of their marriages. No matter that they had also taken their earning ability into their marriages, no matter that the first marriage no longer exists, having been dissolved by divorce, No matter that the second marriage does exist and that the man's earning ability is benefiting his second family, to which he is bound by legal and affectional ties. No matter that the ex-husband cannot suffer any deprivation by his remarriage because the ex-wife never gave him anything of which he might be deprived. The husband's economic provider services were common property during the marriage because the wife's reciprocal services were also common property. But by divorce, the wife has withdrawn her services. She doesn't go to her ex-husband's home to do his laundry, mop his floors, and prepare his meals. What Ms. Arundel's argument comes to is this. She agrees with Ms. Friedman that society asks so little of women that apart from bearing his children, the wife's contribution to the husband bears no comparison to the husband's contribution to the wife. In withdrawing her services at the same time that she withdraws her really substantive contribution to the marriage, the children, she is withdrawing something so trifling that Ms. Arundel can truly say the ex-husband is walking away with most of the assets of the marriage. Hence, according to feminist reasoning, the women who make themselves independent by divorce are entitled to perpetuate their dependence by alimony and child support awards. Dr. Weitzman's statistics concerning the ex-husband's improved standard of living are spurious, but suppose they were valid. What then? First, it follows that there is excellent economic reason for placing the children of divorce in the custody of fathers rather than mothers. Second, it follows that during the marriage, the husband performed extremely valuable services for the wife, so valuable that when they are withdrawn, her standard of living falls by 73%. Incidentally, the wife's unpaid services to the husband during marriage are frequently referred to in feminist literature as something justifying compensation. If the services are unpaid, she receives nothing for them. How then can her standard of living fall by 73% following divorce if all she is losing is the non-payment of nothing? Third, it follows that the husband performed his services to the wife at great sacrifice to himself, so great that even with his continued subsidization of her by alimony and child support payments, and despite the ex-wife's withdrawal of her unpaid services, worth $25,000 a year, according to Gloria Steinem's estimate, his own standard of living, once he is partially emancipated from her, skyrockets by 42%. Fourth, it follows that during the marriage, the husband had nothing to show for having raised his wife's standard of living by 73% at a cost of a 42% lowering of his own. Nothing except the loss of his children and his motivation, not to mention the probable loss of his home and so on. But this loss of children and motivation is an economic fact of the first importance. From the economic standpoint, the ex-husband's greatest asset is not his skill, not his degrees and credentials, not his customer goodwill, not his reputation, but his motivation, which in the typical case, since most divorce actions are initiated by wives, the wife herself destroys and then demands to be compensated for. Fifth, it follows that Dr. Weitzman is glaringly inconsistent in maintaining, on the one hand, that the wife's contribution to the marriage is the reason for the husband's and ex-husband's economic success, and on the other, that he owes her a post-marital free ride, despite the fact that she has been a ball and chain on him, lowering his standard of living by 42%. One is reminded of Betty Friedan's assertion that there are, of course, many reasons for divorce, but chief among them seems to be the growing aversion and hostility that men have for the feminine millstones hanging around their necks. Sixth, it follows that Dr. Weitzman disproves her own contention that the wife's contributions to the marriage account for the husband's financial success, and that his future earnings, assets of the marriage for which withdrawn services cannot be responsible, ought for this reason to be shared by the ex-wife. These contributions are said to consist largely of moral support. Why is not this moral support as much community property as the male earning ability it is said to generate? Why is not its withdrawal by divorce a justification for the withdrawal of the earning which is said to result from it? Seventh, it follows from Dr. Weitzman's estimate of the value of the wife's contribution to the marriage that the husband sustains a crippling loss from her withdrawal of these contributions. If they are the reason for the husband's economic achievement, Well, then their denial entitles him not only to withdraw his earnings, but to be compensated. Eighth, it follows that if the 42% statistic is valid, the ex-husband is entitled to compensation from the ex-wife for her lowering of his pre-divorce standard of living by that amount. Such a claim would correspond to the demand made by ex-wives to be compensated for the careers they forfeited by marriage. Dr. Weitzman wants it both ways. The woman marries the man and demands post-marital recompense because marrying him was a favor. She divorces him and demands post-marital recompense because divorcing him is a favor. She asks us to believe that the motivation provided by the wife makes the man an underachiever by 42% while it's acting upon him during marriage, but then functions proleptically to make him an overachiever once it's withdrawn by divorce. It was the thrust of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, that it is contemptible and infantile of women to be economically dependent upon husbands, that the childish mystique they affected for the purpose of perpetuating this dependence and jollying men into supporting them was stifling, undignified, inhibitive of women's growth, and that they should discard their economic dependence and stand on their own feet. Why? Asked Miss Friedan. Isn't it time to break this pattern by urging all these sleeping beauties to grow up and live their own lives? The thrust of Dr. Weitzman's divorce revolution is the precise opposite, that women must remain economically dependent on men, even when they divorce them and withdraw the trifling services upon which Ms. Friedan poured her ridicule and contempt. They must rely on the motherhood card and the mutilated beggar argument, which permit them to drag their children into the custody trap where they wallow in self-generated economic misery and self-pity. Dr. Weitzman proposes that this parasitism should never end. Even after the children are grown, she says, long-married older wives must also be assured of an equal share of all of their husbands' career assets. But wives are assured of their husband's career assets, an assurance they enjoy because of marriage, the stability of which Dr. Weitzman is seeking to undermine by her attempt to make divorce into an alternative institution capable of giving women the same benefits marriage gives them. Over 2 centuries ago, Adam Smith wrote this: "The property which every man has in his own labor, as it is the original foundation of all other property, so it is the most sacred and inviolable. The patrimony of a poor man lies in the strength and dexterity of his hands, and to hinder him from employing this strength and dexterity in what manner he thinks proper, without injury to his neighbor, is a plain violation of this most sacred property. The extortion of support money from ex-husbands constitutes an obvious violation of this most sacred property, and men ought to resist it. Many wives couldn't afford to throw their breadwinners out if the displaced breadwinners didn't pay them to do so." Dr. Weitzman thinks the divorce court should try to maintain the standard of living that prevailed during the marriage, and insofar as practicable, to place the parties in the financial position in which they would have been had their marriage not broken down. In other words, she thinks the purpose of the twin institution of marriage come divorce is to take everything from the man and give everything to the woman, to strap the man into a milking machine forever. This forced labor for the benefit of another person, this slavery, is illegal, but judges impose it anyway because they figure the American male is so docile he will submit, and because it is what judges have always done in the past, like mindless caterpillars following one another around the rim of a saucer, each supposing he's doing the right thing because he's doing what the others do, what he's always done in the past. They cannot see that the rise in the divorce rate from a few thousand in the mid-19th century to a mind-numbing 50% today has altered the nature of divorce from a tragedy affecting isolated members of society to a program for abolishing patriarchy and returning to matriarchy. They cannot see that the main reason for this rise in the divorce rate is the certainty of wives that the anti-male bias of the divorce court is absolutely dependable. Professor Mary Ann Glendon, in discussing compensatory payment to ex-wives, in other words, alimony, says this: "It is to remedy, so far as possible, the disparity which the termination of marriage may create in the respective living conditions of the spouses. It depends on the establishment of the fact of a disparity between the situations of the ex-spouses, and its aim is to enable both of them to live under approximately equivalent material conditions. The idea of compensatory payment is to transfer money from the possession of the male who earns it to the possession of the female who does not earn it and who has no claim to it other than her status as a mutilated beggar. Compensatory for what? For the withdrawal of the services which during the marriage justified her enjoyment of a 73% higher standard of living? Why doesn't her withdrawal of services justify the husband in withdrawing his services? Why should they both live under approximately equivalent material conditions? Why should there not be a disparity in their incomes, since the ex-husband earns his income and the ex-wife does nothing which entitles her to share his earnings? The disparity is the principal reason she married him. Patriarchal civilization is built on this disparity. The male devotes the greater part of his energies to creating this disparity, believing that it will make him attractive to females, and that by offering it to one of them, he can induce her to share her reproductive life with him, and thereby enable him to create a family and procreate legitimate and inalienable children who will benefit from this disparity by having a higher standard of living and by receiving the patriarchal socialization which will civilize them, make them stable and law-abiding and educationally successful. It is thus that patriarchal society puts sex to work to motivate males to create wealth and social stability, the wealth and stability which feminists and the legal system are undermining in order to liberate women and return society to matriarchy. The disparity which feminists and the courts want to get rid of is virtually synonymous with the wealth of society which they want to latch onto. Dr. Glendon tells us that French law authorized compensation, sometimes very substantial, for such harms allegedly resulting from the divorce as the loss of self-esteem suffered by a divorced person, loneliness, or the loss of social position by one who has become accustomed to a high standard of living. The divorced person referred to as the female. She is deprived of her high standard of living. But the ex-husband is equally deprived of his ex-wife's reciprocal services, presumed to be of equal value to the high standard of living he bestowed on her. Or else why was she entitled to the high standard of living? If each is deprived, and if the deprivations are of equal value, why is the woman entitled to compensation and the man not? In Germany, things are much the same. Support of the ex-wife is to be determined with reference to the marital standard of living. In other words, 1, the ex-husband is penalized by the ex-wife's withdrawal of her services. 2, the ex-wife is rewarded at the ex-husband's expense for withdrawing them. Compensation for services rendered is replaced by compensation for services withdrawn. If the woman is to be liberated, the man must be doubly penalized. This is the upshot of the feminist movement, which a generation ago told the American housewife to stop taking a free ride on her husband's back, to give up her parasitism, to be independent, and to stand on her own feet. The woman is said to be entitled to compensation because she suffers from divorce. She should suffer from divorce. The man suffers more because judges discriminate massively against him in order to ease the suffering of the woman. According to George Gilder, in terms of mental and physical suffering, divorce damages the man far more than the woman. To say that divorce hurts women is to say that marriage benefits women. Marriage should and must benefit women. This is what gives men bargaining power and therefore motivation. This is why they are willing to toil and create their families and society's wealth, why their energies and talents can be directed into useful channels rather than disrupting society as they do where families are headed by women. The feminist legal program to supply women with comparable benefits from divorce is destroying the whole patriarchal system, which works by encouraging men to earn money so that they have something to offer women in exchange for their accepting sexual law and order. Men must have something which will induce women to live in patriarchal, two-parent families, that something being chiefly the disparity between men's and women's earnings. Patriarchy makes this disparity the great bulwark of family stability. The feminist legal program wants to convert this disparity into a means whereby the patriarchal two-parent family may be destroyed. Mother custody is a tried and failed arrangement. It does not benefit women. It drags them into poverty and depression. It does not benefit children. It drags them into the same poverty and into a greater likelihood of educational failure and delinquency. It devastates men by depriving them of their children and their role. The failure of the judges and policymakers who create most of these female-headed families to understand their responsibility for them and for the disruption, crime, demoralization, and illegitimacy they produce derives from the disastrous but natural mistake of supposing that a cultural creation like the patriarchal family must be inferior to a biological creation like the female-headed family. Judges cannot grasp the idea that the reproductive pattern found among lower animals is unsuitable for humans. In fact, the father-headed family does not supersede or displace the female-headed family. It builds a second-story structure on top of it. Father custody doesn't create motherless families. We know this from the low divorce rate of the 19th century. It places the children where the money is, and the mother follows along. It places practical advantages on the side of family stability. The betrayal of the family by the legal system is destroying the validity of the marriage contract, the legitimacy of children, the proper socialization of the young, the security of property, and the motivation of work. Anyone who visits the ghetto or an Indian reservation or the Republic of Haiti or other Caribbean islands knows what society is like where families are headed by women. This is the direction in which our own society is headed. It is the program of the feminist sexual revolution to get us there as fast as possible, and it is using its docile ally, the legal system, to achieve that purpose. It is impossible to maintain a stable society where the divorce rate is 50%, where children are deprived of legitimacy, where fathers are deprived of their children, their property, and their motivation. Feminists are now writing books like Barbara Ehrenreich's The Hearts of Men, complaining of men's refusal to make a commitment. Commitment to what? Commitment to a marriage contract which the courts regard as non-binding, except on the husband, who must continue to subsidize his ex-wife after she throws him out of the home, made possible by his labor, takes his children from him, and reduces him to literal slavery. Forced labor for the benefit of another person, the ex-wife. Can you imagine what would happen to lawmakers or judges who reversed the genders in the existing law, who allowed husbands to throw their wives out of the house, to deprive them of their children and their property, and then compel them to send monthly support checks to the ex-husbands who had taken these things from them? Those lawmakers and judges would be torn to pieces by mobs of frenzied women. But this is the existing law with the genders reversed. The destruction of the family is no longer a matter of injustice to limited numbers of men. There are tens of millions of men who have been wiped out by the divorce courts. The political power of tens of millions of men is irresistible. All men need to do to put a stop to this social destruction is to organize on the basis of a plan for returning to the 19th century practice of father custody in divorce cases. Society must use the strength of the mother-infant tie not as a lever for wrecking the two-parent family, but as a prop for preserving it, by guaranteeing to the father the headship of his family and the custody of his children. Then mothers, knowing that divorce will separate them from their children and from dad's paycheck, will reconcile themselves to accepting the patriarchal two-parent family arrangement. Marriage will be stabilized. There will be no feminization of poverty, no general acceptance of the female-headed family and its social pathology. The objection will be made that father custody is unrealistic, that no one will take the idea seriously. In the 19th century, nobody would take the idea of mother custody seriously. The problem used to be just the opposite. When John Stuart Mill wrote, "They are by law his children," someone suggested to him that maybe mothers rather than fathers ought to have custody of the children of divorce. He thought the idea had merit, but that he would decline to support it publicly because it was an idea for which the public mind was insufficiently prepared to make its discussion useful. People will object that things have changed since the 19th century. Indeed, they have. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in the 1830s that in America a single woman can undertake a long journey in safety. Today, a single woman cannot jog in Central Park in safety. The reason for the difference is that the Victorians had stable families and we have unstable families and female-headed families. Poverty has nothing to do with it. Poverty is the consequence, not the cause, of matriarchy. In the 1930s, Chinese Americans suffered from both poverty and racism, and many from a language problem as well. We had Oriental exclusion laws to protect us from what was called the Yellow Peril. But in the 1930s, just as today, Chinese Americans had the lowest crime rate because they had the most patriarchal families. A generation and a half ago, Rosa Parks took a seat in the front of the bus. It was illegal and nobody had ever done it until Rosa Parks did. And then segregated seating came to an end. The day before, it was unthinkable. The day after, a return to the old system of segregated seating was unthinkable. The only reason, really, why father custody seems unthinkable is that nobody thinks about it. Let's think about it. By society's guarantee of father custody, the roles of both spouses are reaffirmed, children are brought up in two-parent families, and society can hope for the kind of stability, creativity, and productivity found in these societies with stable families, societies such as that of the Victorian age and contemporary Japan.